All right, so thank you again for joining us. Welcome to this session on inclusive marketing, why it matters, how it looks in practice, and where to start. My name is Camelia Cristake, and I lead the WFA's diversity inclusion work. So welcome, it's great to see all of you. We are here and we're delighted to facilitate today's conversation, which will be hosted by Jerry Daykin, our wonderful WFA Global Diversity Inclusion Ambassador, Head of Media at Beam Suntory, and as of today, published author. So welcome and thank you. But before I hand over to Jerry in a second, I just wanted to say a few words about who we are for those of you who don't know us. We are a network and global collective of around 140 of the world's biggest brand owners, many present here today, and 60 of the biggest advertising markets in the world. Essentially, we bring together some 10,000 senior representatives from the marketing and advertising industry. And our mantra as an organization can be summed up in two words, which is better marketing. So marketing which is good for business, good for people, and good for society as well. And one of the ways in which we think we can make marketing better, in our view, is by really helping our members and the industry more broadly improve their work on diversity, equity, and inclusion, be that in content and representation as well as in the workplace. That's really important and close to our hearts. So we are delighted to be joined today by some brilliant experts to talk about how we can achieve and what the power of more inclusive representation is. And these are Jerry Daykin, as introduced earlier, Global Head of Media, VP at Beam Suntory. Our second Global Diversity Ambassador, Belinda Smith, founder and Global CEO of The Second Arrow. Efrain Ayala, Global Director of Diversity Inclusion Marketing at Reckitt. Andrew Geoghegan, Chief Marketing Transformation Officer at PZ Cussons, and Steph Matthews, a Senior Business Director at Creative Equals. So welcome and thank you so much for your time and for giving us the opportunity to discuss and hear from your learnings and experiences in this space. You will see at the bottom of your screens some widgets. So feel free, please, to ask questions using the Q&A widget. Please do share your comments and your opinions and experiences as well in the chat. And no need to take notes, as the session will be recorded and shared with a follow-up email. It will also be uploaded on our Global Diversity Inclusion Hub, which includes various resources which you might find useful. So please have a look if you didn't discover this resource yet. And with this, I'm delighted to welcome and pass over to Jerry Daykin, who will introduce the session and take over from here. Thank you so much, Jerry.
Fantastic, Camelia, and thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for joining today. We do hope that although we are here in part to talk about an exciting new book, we actually really think this session itself is something that can hopefully help us as an industry drive towards better marketing. And that's really where this journey started, exactly as Camelia was just talking about. The WFA has a passion for making marketing better. Sometimes that means getting into the weeds of effectiveness. Sometimes it means taking on the Burnett and Field and Byron Sharps of the world. And sometimes it means thinking about what we are to talk about today, which is inclusive marketing, because ultimately we do think inclusive marketing is just better marketing. It really is our job as marketers. And yes, there is a book involved. I've written a book. It's very exciting. Thus ends the plug, though it is available in some good bookstores now, especially Amazon. And the thing that we really wanted to do with the book and this conversation today is move a little bit down this journey from kind of why that's important, why inclusive marketing is important, and really get into the weeds of how. And many of you on this call are on this journey already. Many of you on this call probably further ahead than I am. I don't claim to have all the answers. In fact, one of the reasons I wrote the book and interviewed a lot of people in the process, which we'll talk about in a minute, was precisely because I didn't have the answers. I just had some of the questions. But yeah, I like to think about this in terms of there being a couple of different sides of sort of who I am as a marketer. I could give you my sort of traditional CV, pretty FMCG, CPG heavy, Mondelez, Diageo, GSK, Beam Suntory, leading global digital or media teams, trying to drive transformation and effectiveness and results in some really interesting businesses. Jumped briefly to agency side at Dentsu, somewhere in the middle there. But I also balance that with this side of who I am and what I think about. I volunteer at a number of things, and I know there's a few members of advertising on this call today. It's an awesome organization that supports LGBT plus people working in the advertising industry and also encourages brands to create more inclusive content. I volunteer with something called the Conscious Advertising Network, which is making us think about our media, our spends, our investments. How does that fund what's going on in the world? I'm a WFA Diversity Ambassador, as we've heard about today. I'm also getting married this month, so I've crammed quite a lot into October. But I tell you that last part, and that picture probably quite clearly gives it away, but I'm getting married to a man, so I'm a gay man, and that's part of what I bring as myself to the industry. I bring a lot of privilege. I'm white, middle class, English speaking, you know, lots of things in my favor. But I've had some sense in my life of what it's like to be excluded from marketing and othered by some of the content around us. And then when we think back on the history of marketing, it has been an interesting journey. If you take LGBT representation just as a slice of that to begin with, you can debate it slightly, but arguably the first kind of mainstream TV advert that featured LGBT representation was an advert IKEA made back in the 90s, and it was a part of a series, and this showed a couple shopping for a table, and there happened to be two men in the couple, which, you know, they were just browsing a store and buying a table. It wasn't in some ways controversial, but of course it was hugely controversial at the time. They sort of claimed they weren't trying to make a big political point, but I guess at the time it felt like it was. If I think of my own childhood, my own youth, I quite often talk about this show. Some of you from the UK might recognize it. Some of you from further afield, perhaps not. It was a show called Queer as Folk. It was on Channel 4, which is a sort of a privately funded, the publicly owned TV station in the UK, which has a real charter about showing better diversity. And when I was a kid growing up, believe it or not, almost without the internet and certainly without kind of YouTube and all sorts of things answering a lot of my questions, this was one of the first times in kind of media and culture around me I started to see other LGBT people, started to understand that they existed, that they had good lives, that, you know, there were people a bit like what I was starting to feel out there. And it's not an advert, but it was funded by advertising. And it has always made me think that the power and the importance of what we as advertisers either make or put out into culture. And I think that's a really important thing to sort of level set at the start here, because when we talk about diversity, when we talk about inclusion, representation, we are often talking about slightly different things. One of them is, and they're both hugely equally important, and in fact, in many ways, very connected. But one of them is around internal inclusion, almost more the HR side of things. So it's all of our responsibilities in terms of how do we make our businesses, our offices, our teams, our industry more open, more inclusive. And then there's the external representation of what we put out into the world. Do our adverts properly talk to, represent, connect with the different consumers that are out there? And the book and the conversation we have today is more focused on the latter, though, as I kind of hint at, you can't separate the two, because better external representation is 100% better driven by stronger internal inclusion. But I think D&I, representation, inclusion, it's something, you know, the whole world, every industry is kind of trying to get their head around at the moment. But it matters so much more in marketing, perhaps, than any other industry, because it is literally our job as marketers. It is literally our job to understand consumers, to talk to consumers, to make those people want to buy our products. And it's very hard to do that if you don't understand some of the nuances, some of the variations within those consumers. Now, of course, you know, my history of working for big CPG brands, we're always trying to talk to millions of consumers. So of course we start thinking about averages. We start thinking about what connects people. Not all great advertising, you know, needs to be targeted to specific subsets of people, but we also have to make sure that over the course of what we produce, over the course of the stories we tell, we do represent these people. And it's also going much deeper than just who do we put on the screen. It's about kind of what goes behind the camera. What are the insights? What's the business opportunity? You know, how do we really holistically think about the consumers that are out there? And of course, there are also many, many, many aspects of diversity, only a handful of which we'll ever talk about, only a handful of which are on screen at the moment. Many different aspects of what makes us unique and wonderful and different. And in many ways, we are all diverse, however much you might, not define yourself in that way. Maybe you're a parent, maybe you're not. As we get older, perhaps your ability will change. As you're older, perhaps people will treat you and represent you differently. We are all diverse and wonderful and unique in our own ways. And we're not really here to sweat the why, but there is a fantastic, reason why this is a good thing to do. And it's a sort of a win-win, maybe even a win-win-win, because it's also kind of positively good for yourself as a person, as a marketer who wants to feel good about their job. But absolutely, it drives commercial advantage, and absolutely inclusion and representation drives societal change. Now, we don't want to overstate the power of marketing, but it absolutely can have an impact. It absolutely can change people's perspectives. And actually, there's a fantastic chapter in the book, if you do read it, that Camelia wrote, which really goes into some of the stats, some of the facts that back up why this is important. And if you're struggling to make that case in your business or to your colleagues, dig into that and find out. But we've been on a journey with this fantastic group of people from the WFA Diversity Task Force, many of whom are on the call today. So it's great to see you, to think about not so much the why, but the how. How do we convene, curate, catalyze, and challenge the industry to think about what we could do differently, and how we actually get to inclusive marketing? Why, with a lot of us wanting to deliver this, are we not always getting to it? And then we've also been thinking about kind of this on a sort of a spectrum of where brands could and should get to. And it kind of starts at the lower half of this, which is where we really think every brand should be able to get away from, which is either, complete exclusion of certain groups of people, or, to be blunt, some fairly basic stereotyping of who those people are, perhaps, starting to show some different diverse groups, but perhaps even doing damage by simplifying them and reducing them to stereotypes. It's a place where every single brand, we believe, should be able to get to, which is, positive, fair representation, inclusion, truly representing, but also reflecting different needs, different consumer wants, appealing to that kind of broad audience. And there's a stage certainly beyond that when you think about really sort of what you might call purpose-based marketing, or real like storytelling, which deliberately tells an inclusive, a representative story. And certainly not all marketing ever needs to get to that point, and that depends a lot on kind of what your brand stands for and whether it has a reason to do so. But with that fantastic group of people, we produced last year this guide to diversity and representation, and that whole creative process, and asked ourselves right across that process, from kind of the briefing, from production, and when we actually go live, where are we losing out on some of that inclusion? Where are we missing the opportunity to be more representative? And there are, 12 full stages of that. We really went into kind of the weeds of that. We really went into the detail of that. And sometimes I like to cluster them just to simplify it a little bit into kind of maybe 4 broader phases across that journey. But for each of those phases, we asked ourselves loads of questions. Some of the marketers working on that task force said, these are the questions we need to ask ourselves at this time. These are some of the things we need to start thinking about and doing differently to make sure that we are thinking about different audiences when we're writing the brief, to make sure that when we're in post-production, we're not accidentally cutting out or editing or removing some of the pieces that make our stories true. And actually across all of this, to be honest, that we don't just think about comms and our advertising, but we think bigger than that. We think about our business, our services, our products. If you haven't got that basic guide, find it on the WFA website, scan that QR code, get a copy of it. It's free to everyone, whether you're a WFA member or not. But then it kind of inspired me and challenged me and made me think, wow, it's great to have all these questions, but wouldn't it also be great to start having more of the answers? And a perfect storm of things happened. I had some time off between a couple of roles. I got approached to write a book, and I thought, great, let's write a book on inclusive marketing and really go into those 12 stages, really build out that framework and say, what do we need to do? How do we land this each stage of that process? Pretty shortly into that writing process, I realized that I didn't have all the answers. I mean, how could I possibly? If you're trying to be inclusive in a project like this, you're always going to need to hear from different voices. And my day job has always been working very much in the media part, so to some extent I'm less exposed to other bits as well. And that's why, in terms of like the real makeup of the book, and to extent what you're going to do now in the rest of this webinar, it all became about the other people I spoke to. And I had 20 conversations, well, over 20 conversations with a range of really fantastic marketers working in different sides of our industry, media owners, agencies, brand side, consultants, tried to be a really intersectional group of people as well, trying to bring different aspects of diversity and unique life experience to that. And actually quite a lot of the book, and perhaps even the majority of the book, is kind of actually the interviews and the conversations we had together, because I personally found them absolutely fascinating, really, really interesting conversations, incredible life experiences, incredible anecdotes, and incredible, practical guidance that many of these people had. We won't have time to go into any of them by any means, but actually Nicola Mendelsohn, many of you will know from Meta, wrote the foreword, and she talked about a Zulu word that I have to read, Sawubona, which means I see you. And it really is just about inclusion, about representation, about the importance, the power of actually just being seen. I had a wonderful conversation with the often outspoken marketing professor, Mark Ritson, just talking to him about why he stumbled upon inclusion 20, 30 years ago when he was doing ethnographic research around sort of San Francisco's LGBT community, just trying to understand why that community was taking and playing with and distorting brands, because it didn't felt like traditional brands spoke to them. I have some really interesting perspectives, like Ella Hall, who currently leads marketing at Royal Holloway, talking to me about kind of some of the nuances of how you get representation right, where we can go wrong, where we can try and do more harm than good, especially talking to trans representation, but really across that representation. Had a fantastic conversation with Christina Mallon, leads inclusive design at Microsoft, talk about her own journey in terms of dealing with changes in her own physical abilities, what that's been like working in industry, and also how that's inspired her to really champion the empower of inclusive product design. Had slightly surreal conversations with two of my current and my former CMO, Jessica and Tamara, just talk about how as a global leader in a business, how do you scale this stuff? Really fascinating conversations as well, just trying to capture some of the elements of diversity that perhaps still get seen as a little bit taboo: class, neurodiversity, mental health. Yeah, a lot of conversations. But the point is that they all really fed into this kind of structure, fed into the book, and helped us really try and unpack what is possible. How do we deliver it? And we can't go through all 20 plus conversations with you guys today, but we're going to try and bring back to life and sort of have a mini version of some of the conversations I had with those some of the other people who contributed to the book, and one person who didn't contribute to the book, but we're bringing her in live today instead. So with any luck, we're going to try and get Belinda in now, and we know we had a few internet gremlins with Belinda earlier, but Belinda, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me, Jerry?
Yes, we can hear you, Belinda. Awesome.
Fantastic.
And we want to start at this beginning of this journey with us. We're going to talk a little bit about kind of like the briefing process, about how we set ourselves up for success right from the start of the journey, and also kind of the work you've been doing to look at the diversity and inclusion of our industry. But in the book, and now I'm going to start with the same question I kind of asked everyone, which is, why is this topic, why is representation and inclusion so important to you personally?
Yeah, I think you've set it up really well, Jerry. I mean, we work together in our roles at the WFA, so I think it's no surprise that we tend to have some similar thinking on this topic. I would take everything that you've said in your intro and like times 100. I think that you have really undersold us a little bit as an industry. And what I mean by that is I have been on the media buying side of marketing for a very, very long time. And I feel pretty comfortable saying advertising greenlights all of the content that gets put into the world. And what I mean by that is, yes, there's the obvious direct things where we place ads and therefore we are supporting the content directly or supporting the station directly. But ultimately, if we think about social media, if we think about the creator economy, if we think about how things have changed in the digital age, content that gets created is really trying to, when airtime via an algorithm, and many of these platforms and algorithms are supported by ad dollars. So I won't take too long getting off the point here, but what I want to say is that even content that does not have ads in it is hugely directed by ad dollars and by advertisers and what companies think brands will find acceptable versus not. And because many of us working in brands, whether it's on the media side or on the creative side, have such an influence in deeming for society what is acceptable, I think it's really, really important that we walk into that fully aware and that we treat that responsibility as big as it is. I have many similar stories to you, Jerry, about seeing myself reflected in content in the world. And I think the way to push that one step further, because I believe, again, you're being a little polite, is cross the chasm from being harassed, being harmed, being victim of violence, to being acceptable and being celebrated and being educated about through the process of marketing and advertising and how content changes. So I am so passionate about this because for me, it has real physical, real life impacts on the safety of people.
And Belinda, you've worked on just about every side of our industry. So you've been client side, you've been agency side, now you're somewhere in the middle of sort of consultant partner side. What, from that experience, how do you think we do make sure that kind of inclusion gets baked into our insights, into our briefs right at the start? Because it's so easy to lose it right from the first step.
Yeah, I think ultimately, I'm going to say the way that we do it is through internal inclusion, because I believe that this is the ring that rules them all. I will say, though, that it is incredibly important because you can't snap your fingers and have diverse representation around your leadership table in the next 3 weeks. That's a process that takes time. You can't snap your fingers and completely change your culture. Those are journeys that you have to go on. And those journeys look different for everyone. So I think there's a huge amount of value in, I would say, 2 things. One are toolkits, guides, best practices, a lot of the work that we've tried to do within the WFA, and some of the things that you're highlighting in your book as well. And then the other thing, which probably is one of the reasons for your book, but I think it's also hugely important that we talk about people who are, we always say doing it well, but I think people who are at least trying. Because ultimately, no one is yet at a gold standard. And when they get there, the gold standard will change anyway. And so I think we put some to start their foot with it, do it. It's really difficult to ask all of the right questions at a brief stage if you don't have the right people around the table and representing the topic. And that's where step-by-step processes or even outside consultants can come in and help fill those gaps.
Unless it's just my connection, we lost you for a second there, Belinda, but I think we're strong back again now. So I'll quickly try and ask you one last question. And this is a big question that we could fill a whole hour plus on, but you hinted at it there in particular, like the work that you've been doing on internal inclusion, the work we've done in the first wave of the WFA diversity census, with the second wave coming soon. What for you are kind of the 1 or 2 key headlines that came out of that, and or actions you think we can all be taking as an industry?
Yeah, I think one thing that has been really productive is thinking about what can everyone do today based on where you are. A lot of times this conversation gets tough because people think they have to go and hire all new people. And I support that, and I think you definitely should. But until you can change who's represented inside, I think preparing yourself to be an inclusive culture, knowing what some of the top considerations are, asking the right questions, and then looking from I always take like a systems and policy approach. And that's something that came up as well through the DEI census, which is, well, are your policies supportive of parents or those who are neurodiverse, or what kind of benefits do you offer for people who need different things? So I think a lot of the things that we're finding is that even if you're not where you want to be yet from a representation standpoint, there are still things you can do to kind of proverbially your house in order and prepare yourself to be more inclusive, and get started on that journey.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Belinda. Now don't go, because hopefully we'll have some time at the end, and people do ask questions. We can bring all our guests back together at the end. But in the meantime, we are going to move on to the next stage of the process, to the kind of the planning stage. And awesome to have Andrew Geoghegan with us, the CMO of PZ Cousins. And planning is obviously where a lot of the groundwork is done, where you're picking your agency, your partner, your team. Ultimately, you're creating your ideas, whether that is a campaign, an advert, as it often is, whether it's a product or something else, and then kind of go into code to testing. So every phase is important, but this is certainly where a lot of the factory work gets done. Andrew, awesome to have you, and I'll start with the exact same question as, why does this topic matter to you? Why is this so important to you?
Thank you, Jerry. I guess it's really simple, isn't it? Just the right thing to do to tackle inequality, right? Who wants to turn up at work and repress people if they can avoid it? And, unfortunately, we work in an industry where biased advertising is a trap for everybody. And, there's loads of evidence about the business benefits, but I have to say that that's really started to irritate me in the last couple of years, because it's important that this agenda doesn't get co-opted for commercial gain. It's just about doing the right thing as best you can. And as Belinda said, recognizing that it won't be perfect. It's better to try and get it wrong and keep learning. So I think it's just a fundamental start point of, wouldn't the world be better if it was more equal?
I 100% agree with that. And I know you have led, or jointly led, both in your previous role and more broadly, a whole work stream around kind of educating, training marketers around kind of initially gender inclusion, but I think more broadly than that. And also, I think, been a big part of the Unstereotype Alliance and some of the framework that they've produced. So without asking you to kind of explain the entirety of that, how does some of that work, their 3 Ps framework, how do you advise marketers trying to get their head around creative development and some of the sense checks we can all do to make sure that we are getting this right?
Yeah, well, listen, we developed that framework to tackle the tricky question you raised earlier about how you go about making advertising more inclusive, because even when people want to do that, the cards are stacked against them, because advertising relies on stereotypes, and often the people involved in the process are rarely reflective of the broader consumer base and society. So that framework was really straightforward. 3 things. So presence, perspective, and personality. Presence, perspective, and personality, which act as a framework, checklist, questions, which you can use throughout the process, right from an advertising script through into casting and elements of production, recognizing all the things that get in the way. And simply, the 3 elements are presence, which is about who's there. And that's about really making sure you've got a broad range of all types of people there, and you avoid some of your own biases. So often that's good to count. I think it's important to think about representation or presence across the total body of your work, so that you've got real kind of nuance and variability there. It's not just about each ad looking the same as the next. Then perspective is about who owns the narrative. The best work is that where the story's told from the point of view of the protagonist. And that avoids situations where you do have more diverse people, but they may be presented as objects or lacking control. And thinking about perspective also provokes you to think about who's behind the camera, avoiding particularly that archetypal male gaze. And the final one, personality, is the one that I think can make the biggest impact. And that is ensuring that the characters that you portray in the work are fully realized. Because it's so often the case that, for example, you may have someone with a physical disability in an ad, but that's the only reason why they're there.
Yeah.
And when people start to see they're there because of their stories, and that those stories transcend gender or sexuality, I think that's when you start to see the best world, the best work, and the best world, in fact. Appropriate slip of the tongue there, because those divisions, labels, and things are starting to slip away, and we can see people as they really are and how they would want to be seen.
Awesome. I think you may not think this, but you're still relatively new in your role. I noticed a few months back you shared one of the first pieces of work you sort of worked on. That I think was a CareX piece of work, talking about life's a handful, and I love that piece of work for it. It's kind of exactly this kind of like casual representation, showing some very real, very different households, families, and stuff within that. How, as a sort of new leader arriving into a business, did you kind of signal to your colleagues, to your agency teams, to your partners that this was important, and get to that work?
Yeah, I think, thank you, Jerry, for saying that. I mean, I'm a year in, and I think we are making progress across the body of the work in the UK, and also recognizing in other markets like Indonesia, where we have a baby business, that there is a different hill to climb. So there often we see babies with white skin or whiter than expected skin, and that's very normalized. So partly it's recognizing all the differences and nuances in different cultures where you are, but actually, because there's been a lot of progress, and there are now guides, and there's your wonderful book and the WFA framework, actually, you know what, it's been easier to achieve than it was when I started doing this kind of thing 4 or 5 years ago. All I did was to talk to my teams about this and how important I think it is. I thought, and explain to them why. I shared the relevant frameworks, which, like the WFA one, are free to all, and they were shared with the people working directly on the ads at the moment where they needed them. So it was most memorable. And then possibly, or probably as important, is we changed our agencies. So we've hired agencies now working in the UK who understand these issues and want to do the right thing. And that was the thing that's made it so easy actually to do it across the body of work, because everybody gets behind the same idea, and actually it's starting to feel, though it probably never will, easier certainly than it was in the past.
Yeah. The right partners. I love that. And I think a lot of what we've talked about throughout this is that it's often quite small nudges we need to make. We just need to be reminded at the right times and ask the right questions. So awesome, Andrew. You stick around as well. We'll try and have a bit of time at the end of it, but thank you very much. And we'll move on to the next phase of the process, the production bit, where we're actually making the advert or making the product or making whatever it is you need to make. And it's awesome to have Efrain Ayala, in from Reckitt. And one of the things I love about how Reckitt are approaching this is they've created a role which is very much the same way you would maybe drive a digital transformation in your business. It's driving this person whose full-time role and remit and gambit is to drive this. And Efrain, I'll start exactly the same way that I've started with the other questions, by asking, why is this topic so personally important to you? Why does representation matter to you?
Yeah, there's not much I'm going to add to what has already been said, but I think I grew up with a philosophy of, you leave it better than you found it. And so I think, as someone who's been in the advertising industry for a while, I think it's, our moral responsibility, also good business sense, to do something about it, whatever that small something may be. Like you mentioned, I get the benefit and the privilege to do this 40 hours a week. But even if you don't have that flexibility, there's probably 1 or 2 things that you can be implementing in your day-to-day to leave it better than you found it.
Awesome. I know in particular, I know obviously you've been looking at across the gambit of all of these pieces, but in particular, you've done some great work looking at the production process and thinking about who we end up with on set and how we make sure that those sets are then inclusive and welcoming places for those people. What would you share are some of the kind of the key things you've started to think about there that we could all be looking at?
Yeah, I think it's a really great place. And I think it's often the production process is where most marketers will immediately go to when they think about, inclusive marketing, is what's happening in the production itself, specifically in front of the camera. And that is critical. If we're ever going to deliver inclusive marketing, we have to, of course, ensure that we're showing those diverse communities from those diverse perspectives. And oftentimes you hear about some groups talking about, making sure we have diversity behind the camera as well. And at Reckitt, it's an and situation, but we also wanted to acknowledge, if we say we care about the communities we are hiring this talent to portray, we should equally care about the talent as well. So for us, it was about understanding the production environment and ensuring that that's a safe place where all talent feel like they belong, so that they can bring the best to the work that they're doing. So often you hear horror stories about, things happening on set because it's a bit of a loose structure. There's oftentimes not a lot of regulation and guidance. So we decided to explore that, just to ensure that we can bring the best out of all the talent that we bring to deliver our creative. So it's been interesting experience knowing that simple guidelines on setting expectations on what the behavior on set should look like can be so impactful to the team's broader experience and the way they bring work to life.
And that's true. It's true of all of these environments and in our own offices as well, isn't it? If we're trying to bring a more inclusive, more diverse range of people in, we need to be a bit more considerate about how we make sure all those environments are more welcoming and more inclusive, not just get people through the door. Another part of the process, or two parts of the process, is kind of what comes after the production, and the kind of the post-production, the editing, kind of the conversations that come in with localization and what markets will adapt, etc. And I think there's been some criticism at times of the advertisers. Will put some diversity into maybe longer versions of their content, but by the time they cut it down, some of that ends up on the cutting room floor. How do you guys as a global business think about that, work around that, try and advise your teams to try and keep that essence?
Yeah, it's a real challenge, especially when you think about the tens of thousands of digital ads that might be created from a hero piece of content like a film. I think fundamentally you measure what you care about. So for us, it was just about starting to measure what those adaptations started to look like and how far or how close they were to the original asset. And so we are fortunate enough to have some partners with some pretty slick tools that enable us to do that measurement with an AI technology. So we're able to see what the representation and portrayals happening within the digital ads are and compare them back to the source assets or the hero assets that kind of inspired all of that work. And so just start with measuring what you care about. Now, if you don't have fancy slick tools, you can easily just set a precedence to do reviews of creative. We have found where we don't have that tool implemented, it's just about creating the space for that to be reviewed and looked at and have an open discussion. Maybe there's something the main development team can be doing something to enable more adoption of the source material and start to limit and mitigate some of that, editing out the inclusion and the efforts being made on diverse representation. So it starts with measure what you care about and take the time to look and make the space for those discussions to happen.
And I didn't suggest that I was going to ask you this, but it feels like I'll try, and you can pass if you don't want to. But I think one of the things I think you guys have started to do really well is not just look at the creative, but also start to challenge your product teams and your development teams around how inclusion works there. Is there anything you can share in terms of how we think beyond just the adverts into actually the products? How do we get started there?
Yeah, I think, Reckitt's model has been around each of our brands selecting a single social or environmental issue that they can meaningfully and measurably contribute to. That gives us kind of the territories where our brands can actually disproportionately benefit specific communities.
Yeah.
So once that strategic vision and alignment is set, we then essentially ask ourselves, do our range of products welcome that particular group of people into our brand and in our category? And if not, what more do we need to bring? So, we're very early on in our journey at Reckitt, but we're taking this notion of having positive societal impact while also creating category growth very seriously, and more than just our communications. We're also looking at our product portfolios to making sure they're also up to snuff.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. And again, don't go away. And if people have any questions for Efrain, we'll come back to them at the end. But before that, and last but no means least, Stephanie Matthews, who's one of the senior leaders at the fantastic consultancy Creative Equals. And spoiler alert, Steph isn't actually in the book, because although we were going to do an interview, we weren't able to in the end. And so we're going to do it live now, and we're going to tap into your brain today. So thank you so much for joining us today, Steph.
Thanks for inviting me.
Pleasure. And we're talking very much about kind of the end of the process, but the end of the process is, just as important as the beginning. Certainly from my perspective, kind of the media, how you get it out there, how you, promote it to people. But I guess in particular, Steph, as someone who's kind of worked in that industry, or as a consultant across loads of different brands, maybe thinking about how we starting to get into the evaluation, into how we kind of build the business case, etc. But I will start the same way I have with our other contributors and ask you, why is this topic so important to you? Why does your passion come to make this your full-time job?
Yeah, it is my full-time job. I pivoted into this space about 4 years ago, coming from an advertising insight and client sides experience. And I think that a lot of people I'm finding with the clients that we work with, there's often a personal driver or a passion or reason as to why they're doing it. And for me, it's my identity. So I identify as a queer brown mixed race woman. And yeah, very similar to you, Jerry, I kind of growing up didn't really see any role models, didn't kind of see myself on screen, whether it was TV shows or advertising. And then the more I kind of got to work in advertising, the more I realized how impactful it could be, and how much change it could have, and really kind of making people and society think differently about people like myself. It's the impact it can have. It is quite powerful, and I'm really privileged and lucky to be working in this space.
Awesome. And yeah, in your work across many different companies, how have you started to help people kind of measure that success, keep moving along that journey, kind of build the internal business case? How do you recommend people who perhaps, if they've got tough stakeholders they've got to convince and things?
Yeah, I mean, you referenced it earlier on when you didn't want to kind of go into much, but there's the kind of why behind it. It's the business case, because if there's no moral reason, if people aren't kind of invested, it's like, well, what's the business case? What's the impact on profitability? But we're always hearing, like, what do we do and how do we do it? And for us, it's always about going back to looking at an audit, essentially, of what you have internally. So thinking about your processes, it's thinking about perhaps your campaigns, and it's thinking about the people as well. So who are in the teams, who are in your agency teams, who are in your partners, and really auditing that before you can kind of dive in. But what I will say is, everyone's mentioned it here, the brief is such an easy place to start, because that is your amalgamation of everything from different parts of the business, from your suppliers, and you can really kind of start to unpack in the brief as to where diversity, equity, and inclusion is actually being incorporated. Awesome.
What do you see, working with lots of different companies are thinking about this, and in your own business, what do you see as kind of some of the emerging trends or shifts as we look to the future in this space? Kind of, it feels like we're starting to see a lot of companies kind of get their head around some of the basics in this space, but then what comes next? Where do we go next?
Yeah, we are actually looking into the trends space for our clients, and our trends team have identified 4 areas, which I will probably butcher, but I'll give you a kind of overview of Awesome. What they are. And the first is demo flux, and that's essentially thinking about how people identify personally is changing. It's becoming more fluid, and so it's like, how as brand and businesses we can incorporate that into our existing processes. The second is AI and automation, and I know Belinda talked about this. So we've got these AI programs that are designed to kind of make it easier for us, but actually what they might end up doing is perpetuating bias. So it's important that we kind of have that inclusive lens on that. That also kind of leads into data privacy as well. So we're being encouraged to capture all of this data, quite personal data about ourselves, and where does that go? What happens to that? What happens if that's kind of commodified and sold on? How do we protect that? How do we have that duty of care of the marginalized groups that we represent? And then lastly, I think we've all felt this, is DEI fatigue. I've been in this space for 4 years. I've kind of seen it escalate, and there are clients that are just kind of waiting They're kind of waiting, they're not kind of pushing forward on it, which concerns me slightly. And a lot of that is around kind of not wanting it to kind of be politicized, because that kind of is where it's got to with identity. So that's kind of, they're the things that they're the trends, I guess, that are happening that marketers can tap into to make sure that they're excelling when it comes to inclusive marketing.
Awesome. Thank you, Steph. So, right, we're going to come back to you all in a moment. So I think we've had some issues with the chat, but if you do have questions, the Q&A functionality seems to be working. Turn your cameras back on. I'll throw a question that's aimed straight at you, Efrain, which is, I think you piqued up a lot of people's interest when you mentioned some of these AI tools. Are there any specific names, any companies that you can kind of suggest that people could go investigate, or are they all very proprietary things? I don't know how available they are.
No, we're working with CreativeX, actually. So they are typically known for a tool to help you manage your creative best practices in a world with tons of digital ads at scale. We've been partnering with them on a new function that they have within that tool that maps some dimensions of representation and some dimensions of portrayal to help us kind of understand at a macro level what's happening there. So I would reach out to CreativeX if you're interested in learning more about that tool.
Awesome. People also ask, is there a piece of work that you guys are really proud of, or one that you admire from another company, which in your view can kind of help inspire others? Belinda, I might try and throw that back to you to start with. Is there sort of any sort of particular standout piece of work you've seen over the last year or so?
Oh, goodness.
It's always a tough one.
Sorry. Interestingly, there's been a lot of good pieces of work. The reason I kind of rubbed my little bald head and said, oh goodness, is I feel caught in the moment where you see a piece of good work and you want to be excited, and then you hear a little bit more about the company or the process behind the scenes and you don't feel very great about that. So and again, this is because I spend most of my time in life thinking about internal inclusion. I will say though that things that I hold up as examples of good work tend not to be standout pieces. So you already spoke about IKEA. I love to talk about them because they are redefining what the word home means, which is really, really important work for us globally for a lot of different reasons. But you know, they don't have a banner that says we are reinventing what the word home means. It's part of their process and their DNA, and at this point it's part of their heritage. I had oh man, well now I hope there's not too many Unilever people on the call, but I had a lot of fun in 2020 being sidelined and just watching the Ben and Jerry's debate go back and forth, because when Ben and Jerry's started using Twitter to be really vocal about their activism, people thought it was a stunt, but it actually wasn't. It's also part of their culture and their heritage. I think, you know, Lego is a company that I tend to think about a lot. And again, there are not banners everywhere saying Lego, we're for fun for everyone and happiness and inclusivity, but they are. And so ultimately, what I look for when I think of a sign of who's doing this well is, where does it feel natural? Stephanie mentioned a good point about a lot of people feeling burnout. And I tend to think there's like a one-to-one correlation of initiative-based action and burnout, which is if you think that it is your job to monitor the world or your consumers or your category for crisis, and then use every crisis to spin up a, you know, bespoke initiative that speaks directly to those things, what besides burnout are you ever supposed to feel? Which is why I think it's so important to start integrating at the root, whether that is the brief, whether that's in front of the camera, behind it with the talent, whether that's internal, whether that's system and policy. That tends to be overall where I see sustainability and success.
I think that is a great answer, because I sometimes struggle to say what I see as great examples, because obviously there are the sort of big purposeful campaigns that do stand out, but a lot of what we're talking about doesn't necessarily stand out. You're just doing good marketing and it's like, it's good marketing. A question, actually, we'll go on to another one from for you actually, Andrew. Bruna asks, we did touch a little bit about agency and partner selection. You talked a bit about how you kind of managed to make sure you had some agencies that really aligned with your views. I guess it's sort of a question about like how did you make sure that as part of that process, and to what extent maybe do you think about bringing in kind of like special diversity agencies or things like that?
Yeah, I think it's in the selection process, you need to be upfront and ask them for what their policies and commitments are, and just get some numbers, and you'll find out. I mean, there are some specialist agencies out there working in this space, but I think in the longer term, the opportunity is for this just to be how agencies are. And I think unless you ask those questions, you don't find out. Simple as that, really.
And is there any work that really stood out, maybe even for one of your incumbent agencies, or just that really stood out to you as a great piece of work that you've seen recently?
Yeah, it's difficult. I'm maybe I'm a bit glass half empty, but I see there's still loads of opportunities. And if you look at, I think the UK since the ASA put in the regulations has improved in some ways, but become more predictable, actually. And there are certain things which haven't happened. So I think, with the exception probably of Channel 4, disability is still massively underrepresented. I think it's something like, I don't know, don't quote me on the stats, 4% of ads, and I think 20% of people in the UK. So there's but there are flourishes. There's one I think you share with me. I really loved the androgynous alien in the John Lewis ad last year, and that was because it was so fresh and just brilliantly baked into the whole thing. They weren't making a point. It just felt natural and right.
I think there's loads of good points there. I think disability inclusion is a really interesting one, partly because it's as you say, statistically quite low, and also I did speak to a few people kind of from that community during the making of this, and one of their challenges was, as marketers do start to represent them, they tend to focus on a lot of the negative things about disability, and it's kind of like how tough and how hard their lives are, which is true of many diverse initiatives. But I know of I think it was on the call, there's a Dale Green and some of the work that Mars have done. Maltesers in the UK in particular always gets called out, but they did some great work of kind of like celebrating the lighter side of disability, and I think that's important.
And do you remember the Aunt Bestie's ad from probably 2 years ago?
Yes, yeah.
That was a wonderful example where the full personality of that lead character and an quote unquote older woman was just so wonderful. And so there are examples out there, I think, but fewer. And you're right, it's about portraying people with all their humanity and not just about their disability or whatever it might be.
Last couple of questions. Steph, I don't know if you know the answers or if anyone else does. Is there an organization out there that does reputational analysis of companies based on diversity and inclusion? Is that, I don't know if that's part of what your audit is or how?
No, it's not part of what our audit is, but I'm pretty interested to know if anyone else does know one. No,
anyone know that? A company that does?
We don't look at reputation.
Yeah, there is an index by Refinitiv that looks at, I think they look at about 7,000 companies globally, and they publish it once a year. And they're obviously with the belief that the more diverse and inclusive a business is, the better its performance is. So that is widely available.
Awesome. And so, Steph, I'll throw this other question to you instead then. When we're thinking about these 12 steps of the creative process, which one in your view is kind of the most important to tackle, or perhaps the one that, lacks resources the most? I mean, they're all important, but, where you think there's maybe the most to be done?
I think the one that can be, well, my favorite one, or the one that I've seen has had the most impact, is when you go upstream to the brand strategy. Because what I found with working with clients is those that have it truly embedded upstream, it's so much easier to embed it further down. On one of our clients, they have inclusion as one of their brand values. And you can really see when it's really, really embedded. I mean, it's hard, but how much easier it is then to kind of get everything shaped and across the line. It really does make such an impact coming upstream.
Awesome. Efrain, could I ask you the same? Is there a phase in the process which you think really can pack a huge punch if we get right?
Yeah, I would say any sort of research project, especially that goes into developing the brand strategy, just to kind of riff off of Steph. I think oftentimes we find that the research and recruitment briefs are written in very homogenous ways that won't enable any sort of differentiated insight. So I think it's really important that if you're going to focus on one place right away, or first, I would think about how you develop your insights that drive your choices, because if those insights are lowest common denominator, you're not really going to understand the strategic brand opportunity to have a positive impact. It just becomes bolt-ons. So I would say, yeah, upstream, like Steph was saying.
Awesome. And I think we are pretty much at time now, I'm afraid, but one of the things that we're doing with the WFA Diversity Task Force going onwards is looking at these 12 stages and working with some of the other groups of marketers within that, for instance, the Insights Forum, for instance, the Procurement Board. And we've already done some work with the Media Board and GARM, the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, to say, let's deep dive into media, let's deep dive into insights analytics. And actually the next bit we're doing, which Efrain and some others are really involved in, is a deep dive into that production environment, because all the way along the journey, we see there being needs. The final question is actually for me, so that's perfect, isn't it? Is there, what have I learned? What's something I've learned in the process writing this book? I think I've sort of learned, which can sound daunting. It's sort of learned how little I know. And, I sat down to try and write a book, having been in loads of conversations about this, and realized that I really, really needed other people's perspectives, other people's inputs to get this, that, however hard I tried myself, I couldn't write a book that was like the perfect example of how we deliver inclusion. And then even with everyone's help, it's not a perfect book, I'm sure. But that's kind of the message behind all of this, which is that although as individuals, we can open our mind, we can do everything we can to step outside our bubbles, we can force ourselves to ask some different questions, we're always going to find it easier to deliver more inclusive marketing if we surround ourselves with different perspectives, different opinions, occasionally even people that disagree or have different perspectives on things. And so, yeah, I don't see that quite so much as an unclimbable challenge, but just the wonderful fact that we're going to keep doing this for the rest of our careers, and hopefully continue learning and continue discovering more as we go. So thank you so much for our fabulous interviewees, panelists, for joining us today. I suppose I should end with a final plug, but yes, the book is out today. It's out there in the UK, out in the US at the end of the month, I should be honest. You can get it from the publisher, you can get it from Amazon, you can get it from a number of other bookstores. And we are putting the interviews that we did do as part of the book, we're going to put many of them onto the WFA YouTube in partnership with Campaign over the coming months, just to kind of really bring to life some of those fantastic conversations we had. So look out for those. But yeah, the reason we wrote the book, that I wrote the book and interviewed all these people, it's probably not going to make me a millionaire, I'll be honest, but it really is about just continuing this conversation in the industry, pushing us to do more, to do better in this space, and just for us all to kind of be inspired and challenged a little bit on just whatever we do in marketing, whether you're in charge of everything, whether you do a small corner of a small campaign somewhere, you can all help us push towards more inclusive marketing. And if you're a member of the WFA and you want to get even more involved in this, by all means, reach out to myself, reach out to Camellia. The WFA Diversity Task Force meets monthly and is a great place for kind of sharing this kind of insight and more. So thank you all for joining as well. It means a lot to me that you tuned in and that you cared. So thank you very much, everyone.
And thank you so much.